Welcome. My name is Bob Zdenek. I'm the moderator for the Just Recovery from Natural Disasters, Climate Change, Best Practices, and Innovative Financing. And delighted to be joined by a panel of people doing some really creative work responding to natural disasters and ensuring that the community recovers in this process. And so I'm going to introduce our panel, and then I'm going to provide some overview remarks. And I should first start that I'm the moderator. I'm a senior advisor to the California Coalition for Rural Housing, working with them on rural disaster and several other initiatives, and been involved in community development for over 4 decades, and for 6 years was the director of special initiatives at NCRC. So it's delighted to be back with the NCRC family and doing this workshop. And introduce in terms of the order, Veronica Beatty, who is the CCRH research manager in Sacramento. And she works on a wide variety of issues for their members and staff support and for manufactured housing and modular design. And she's my colleague with the rural disaster research and technical assistance practice that we're going to be launching, shortly. Then we're delighted because we didn't want this just to focus on California. I know we've had some dramatic fire, challenges. We're also delighted to have Leo Barrera, who's with the CDC of Brownsville, Texas. And they've done some great work over the past. Again, Texas represents sort of hurricanes, flooding. So it's another type of natural disaster. We want to look at several of them. They've done some great work around developing the Rapido, which he will talk about. And they're doing some national work around Mi Casita, which is helping communities around in a country that have experienced disasters, helping the residents, low-income residents, rebuild. And that's really a critical issue. So we're delighted to have Leo join us. And so we're excited that you're joining us, and we're going to start with the presentation. So I also want to acknowledge Andrea Salas from CCRH, who's been really helpful in helping to put together this session. So we're really grateful for her support. So the next slide. So I wanted to provide an overview because I think there's some really why this is so important now is this is not optional in many places. This is sort of, I hate to say it, it's the new normal. In so many communities around the country, low-income communities of color around the country, because often located in areas that are more prone to disaster. So this is really becoming a core element. It's not just something that, it happened and then we've got to respond to it. It really needs to be integrated into the planning, preparedness, operational side. So disaster preparedness, planning, and response need to be core skills for community-based development organizations moving forward. It's really got to be baked in, use that analogy, baked into the work, the strategy, the planning. And also community-based development has a critical role to play in disaster rebuilding, both in addressing issues of social and economic equity, where these disasters tend to happen, or people that tend to be mostly impacted, and that housing and rebuilding is just such a core element. And what we see time and time again is without the resources and the capacity, people are scattered. People who live in rural communities who experience a disaster find out the nearest place that they can live is 100 miles away. Well, that creates enormous havoc. So how does community-based development play its critical role in terms of housing, rebuilding, and advocacy? And the goal of this workshop is to inform and position community-based development organizations to be catalysts. Not just to be one of many, but to be a catalyst in responding, engaging other partners. We have great examples, and we're going to be issuing a guidebook very shortly, and we'll have the link available by May 7th, showing you some of the really other creative partnerships that have emerged, whether it's fire, drought, hurricane, or other types of flooding. So it's really this is really important. And there's really some good practice, and I want to thank our panelists because they've really been doing some of the creative thinking here. Next chart. So I just wanted to really quickly give you some of the impact, the context of this, and how it's growing. What we've seen is the fire season in the West, in California, Oregon, Washington State, and actually up into Canada has gone from 73 days to 105 days in 5 years. And we're really scared because we think the fire season in 2021 is going to be more than 105 days based on the lack of rain. 4% of California was on fire. That's bigger than the state of New Jersey. 4% was on fire in 2020. The first now we have a new term, gigafire, of over 1 million square feet. That was 7 counties. I mean, we're facing, we have to respond. We're facing an unprecedented challenge. We have water supply and drought conditions. Dams and lakes are, way below capacity. We're also seeing with climate change, increased heat morbidity. And again, this also tends to impact people of color and communities. African Americans have a 5.3% greater likelihood of heat morbidity. In the Central Valley in California, 71% of agricultural workers who die from heat morbidity or excessive heat are Latino. So again, the impact on people of color, sea level is rising dramatically, longer lasting storms. I lived in New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy, and I saw what happened with sea surge and the hurricane. Hurricane Harvey, a couple of years ago, dumped 38% more water than normal. 2 days after Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey in late October, it snowed. This is all unprecedented. It's new. It's sadly something we have to face in the present and in the future. So climate change has been a huge impact in terms of accelerating the damage of natural disasters. Next chart. So critical element is my last chart: preparation, planning, and resiliency. Really critical. Again, it's not, you want to just recover, you have to be prepared, you have to plan, and you have to use resilient strategies. We see sort of 3 key elements in the housing development process. The really critical nature of location efficiencies. And this is work CCRH and their longtime director, Rob Weiner, have been working on for many years. How do we have evacuation routes? What type of geological soil? What do we need to buttress it with? Engineering, units per building. There are a lot of key issues here. There's a lot more. I'm just giving you a quick overview. Construction efficiency. So not just location, but construction. Safety features. Obviously, in our part of the country, earthquake fortification. And this point applies everywhere. Durable and non-degradable building materials, on-site drainage, and you'll learn from the CDC of Brownsville presentation. They're great work in that area. Operation efficiencies. How do we use technology to help residents who may not make sure that everybody has access to it, so that when something happens, you can get people out. We lost too many lives in the Paradise Fire in Butte County, California in 2018. Escape routes, training, making sure staff, residents, partners are trained. And in our case, communication in English and Spanish, really critical, since nearly 40% of our population are Spanish speakers. So in California, and that's true in significant numbers in Texas and obviously Puerto Rico. So again, these are some of the operation efficiencies. The next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Veronica to do her presentation.
Hi, I'm Veronica Beatty. I'm the research manager for California Coalition for Rural Housing. The California Coalition for Rural Housing is a statewide member-based organization that advocates for policy, does research, and provides technical assistance to rural communities on a wide array of housing issues, with the goal of promoting and preserving affordable housing in sustainable, healthy communities throughout California. CCRH has been working on disaster planning and preparedness in recent years because our members want to better respond to that heightened frequency and intensity of natural disasters, particularly fire, in the communities they serve. Next slide. Rural California has always been disproportionately subject to natural disasters due to a lack of physical infrastructure, historic under-resourcing, lower levels of staffing and capacity within government and community organizations, geographic isolation, incredible spans of defensible space, and other considerations. As the growing impact of climate change has exacerbated natural disasters across California, rural communities have been hit the hardest. The fires and subsequent floodings of the past few years have led to a significant loss of rural lives and devastation of communities. And in the state experiencing the nation's greatest housing crisis, the loss of affordable housing in disaster-affected communities has been debilitating. Next slide. Disasters have a multiplier effect on the affordable housing crisis. They create direct displacement due to reduced housing supply and housing costs driven up by new demand, making it harder for low-income residents to find adequate and safe housing that echoes into the surrounding communities. And we know that fires are likely to continue destroying affordable homes. Across California, there are 140,000 units of affordable housing in the wildland-urban interface vulnerable to fire. May be a little difficult to see, but the counties shown in purple on the map here have nearly 100% of their affordable housing units in that wildland-urban interface area. So we know the communities we work in are having some of the greatest affordable housing need in the state and are relying on housing stock that's under threat of destruction. And despite being the most impacted by natural disasters, are often the least prepared to prevent, respond, and recover. Next slide. So our response here at CCRH has been to provide technical assistance to those communities so that they can better address disaster recovery and minimize damage from future potential disasters. We also advocate for policies that will provide flexible funding and resources for both temporary and permanent housing support in the wake of disaster, and that research and dissemination of better practices. As Bob mentioned, we're developing a rural disaster planning guidebook targeted to rural affordable housing providers who are serving these low-income families and communities of color across the state. And I talk a lot in the last slide about the deficits in rural communities, but it's important to mention we've also seen these communities be incredibly resourceful and creative. Our members have been responding to the need for better disaster preparedness with the same passion they bring to providing homes. And that looks like creating new staff positions that are disaster focused, building out preemptive partnerships with organizations they may not have worked with before, like United Way and the Red Cross, social service providers. They're modifying their building designs. One of my favorite examples is on the slide here. That's Burbank Housing Spike Creek community in Guerneville, where the whole buildings are actually up on these podiums to mitigate flood risk. They also have a boat launch built into the community. And it looks like building on the preparedness conversation to gain support for a variety of housing options. So I'm going to tell you quickly about two of our members' responses that are featured in case studies in our guidebook. Next slide. The first is Community Housing Improvement Program, or CHIP. CHIP has built more than 3,000 housing units in their 7-county service area in Northern California and is acknowledged as an innovator and leader in rural housing issues. When Northern California was hit by the Camp Fire, most of the town of Paradise and several other surrounding towns were destroyed, including 95% of the housing stock in Paradise, and including CHIP's 36-unit Paradise Village that we're looking at here on this slide. When Paradise and the surrounding communities went to rebuild, CHIP's knowledge was key. They were one of the only affordable housing providers operating in the area, and they had knowledge about state funding programs and the housing development process that proved invaluable as the community went to rebuild, particularly because they were able to clarify the disaster tax credit process, since they were the only recipient in the region familiar with their use. CHIP's ramping up its housing development capacity and is bringing online 5 new rental projects in the near future, and also looking at a single-family rental program that's particularly important because that type of housing is really not going to come back unless we plan for it. CHIP also helped to lead the Campfire Collaborative that began as a long-term recovery team meeting emergency needs and has turned into this really fascinating ongoing space for community collaborations. They have a housing committee that incubates those collaborations, connects member organization, and provides information to partners who are looking at the housing challenge in a variety of ways. One of the outcomes of those new collaborations has been between the Rebuild Paradise Foundation, the local Habitat for Humanity, and CHIP, who are working to inform the use of donated land within the Campfire burn scar for affordable housing and other community needs like parks and road continuations. And I think what we can also see from the CHIPS example is that rebuilding can change the conversation. The town of Paradise used their long-term recovery process to do really deep community engagement and think about how to rebuild with more housing options, including affordable housing, and really create a more equitable and greener community because they took the time to really engage the community members and do that visioning. Next slide. The other example I wanted to highlight is Self-Help Enterprises. Self-Help Enterprises works across the 8-county Central Valley region and is one of the nation's leading producers of self-help housing. As drug conditions became more common in the valley, many of their homeowners began contacting self-help housing in crisis because they were having difficulties with the wells that provided water to their homes. And at the time, USDA could only provide $11,000 for a new domestic well, which is a pretty limited amount of funding. And self-help enterprises responded to that by developing a prototype for a temporary tank system and starting to build private philanthropy relationships that could assist dozens of families in bringing their water wells back online. They took that private philanthropy and pilot project and went on to work with the California Office of Emergency Services at the state and county level. And they were able to get 1,600 water tanks installed in homes just in 2014 to provide immediate access to water. They built on that advocacy and started working with the State Water Resources Control Board to drill new wells for households whose wells ran dry and expanding access to well assistance programs to rental properties. And what's fascinating about this, I think, is you really see self-help enterprises there responding to community need. I think from my perspective, I might not expect a developer to be engaged in making sure water access is available for families, right? That's kind of part of the housing, but a well isn't a house. But they saw that that's what their service community needed. And so they built capacity around how to address these well issues, took on these advocacy fights to make sure that their families and families in the communities surrounding them had access to water. They did problem solving. They were able to focus on these homeowners, provide tanks and wells, and in part because it helps preserve the value of the home that these families have spent their time building and investing in. And then finally, there's this combination of technical assistance and advocacy. So by both working within existing programs and fighting to expand access to those programs, Self-Help Enterprises really has been able to go all across the board to ensure what works. Next slide. So our guidebook dives into these two stories as well as other examples from our members' work to showcase and improve the affordable housing sector's response to disasters. It includes practical advice around those efficiency Bob mentioned, around location, design, construction, and operation, as well as recommendations for government at all levels. And here's just kind of my top picks for each of those levels, but we've got plenty more where that came from. And that looks like for local governments, centering community engagement in recovery and remembering that affordable housing developers and providers are key players in that process. At the state level, CCRH is advocating for the creation of a statewide emergency bridge loan fund for housing recovery. And at the federal level, advocating to acknowledge this new normal and to permanently authorize the CDBG DR funding that our members have relied upon as part of the yearly appropriations process. Next slide. And finally, just in general, I want to emphasize to this audience that meeting existing affordable housing need is a disaster preparedness strategy. If we are already operating in a housing deficit, it makes communities more vulnerable. I want to re-emphasize that affordable housing developers are valuable partners in all stages of the disaster process because they're accustomed to navigating complex funding programs, layering public money to make projects work, used to thinking about and adapting to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. And that's what we need to do in our disaster planning and recovery, right? Is prioritizing meeting the needs of vulnerable populations. And we also, in the long term, need to coordinate the way we think about affordable housing planning, fair housing planning, and our disaster preparedness. Because if we aren't intentional about how we plan to build in advance of disasters and rebuild in their wake, we'll continue to create inequitable communities where housing opportunity is limited and communities of color and low-income communities continue to be disadvantaged. So I'll close by saying, please subscribe to our mailing list to keep up to date on all of our disaster-related research and advocacy. And I'll turn it back over to Bob.
Thank you, Veronica. That was terrific. And the examples were really compelling. I love the one with the boat launch. I mean, you don't think of California, we talked about fire and droughts, but there's also flooding. And so again, it's the creative response and really making and understanding this is just so core, to the work that we do in supporting low-income communities. And also, hopefully in the question and answer session in a couple of weeks, we can talk about some of the advocacy and policy initiatives that are really important. And also at the national level, we're trying to get CDBG, disaster DR, which is disaster recovery funds, annually, and also more quickly. Sometimes it takes 2 years for the funds to really hit or arrive at the community that really needs them. And how do you, in that 2-year period, when you're trying to rebuild, wait. You have to get other types of sources. So anyway, thank you, Veronica. That was a great overview. And we're going to move from California to our friends in South Texas, to Leo. They've done some remarkable work for many years around disaster response and housing, and share their strategies. So Leo, who's the director of housing for real estate and development for Community Development Corporation of Brownsville. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate the invitation to present here. Like Bob said, my name is Leo. I am with CDCB, Come Dream, Come Build, formerly known as Community Development Corporation of Brownsville. Was a mouthful, so we had to kind of rebrand a little bit. Since we do so much work outside of the city of Brownsville now, we had to rethink our name. So I will be talking about Rapido. A few of the partners involved with this program was BC Workshop. They are a nonprofit architecture firm based out of Dallas with offices in Brownsville and in Houston. Some local organizers in the Rio Grande Valley are Loop and Arise, and they were our community support and outreach arm. And Texas Housers and Texas A&M Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center were our kind of research and policy and academic piece of the program. Next slide, please. So Hurricane Dolly hit the South Texas coast in 2008. And it wasn't until 2014 did our CDBG-DR funds really make an impact. We did do some housing in 2011 with the county, but we did maybe 30 houses, right, and a few other organizations doing houses here and there, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the real need that was needed. And in 2014, that program was run through our local COG, and the funds came from the General Land Office, which is weird for us because our housing agency in Texas is the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. They run all the home and CDBG and NSP and 9%, 4% tax credit deals. They are our housing agency. So, it was a bit weird that the General Land Office, was, in charge of running this DR money. Next slide, please. So Rapido is a temporary to permanent model. And so basically, what that means is that we will use standard building components. This is a normal stick built project, but that will expand down the road and become your permanent home. Next. So with the Rapido program, we did 20 houses in the Rio Grande Valley. So that is, if you can see on the map there, it's the southernmost 3 counties of Texas. So those are some renderings of the houses we did, 20 families, all quite a bit different in design, as you can see through those renderings. Next slide, please. So here is a rendering of prototype 0. So in red is what we call the core, and that is the temporary component of the project. And the core is made up of a small living room and kitchen, a full-size bathroom, and a bedroom. And they range in square footage anywhere from 400 up to 600 square feet. And that will depend on an ADA restroom or not. And to the right is the rendering of the full build out. So the addition and the entire component. Next slide, please. So I know it's really hard to see some of these diagrams on my slides, but this is basically crosscuts of the core. And I'm sure at some point you guys will have access to the slides, so you can kind of dive in and see these a little bit further. But to emphasize on what you can see, right in the middle of those renderings in green are panels, and that's what makes this program a bit unique. Obviously, Grow Home isn't new, right? The Katrina cottages and all types of examples of building something small and adding to it later. But we tried to focus on a panelized system here Next slide, please. So here we have some of our employees building these panelized systems that I'm talking about. So what you can see here are some floor panels and some wall panels. The big stack in the back are the wall panels that we used to deploy to site. Next slide. These are panels being delivered to site. So you can see the floor panels being set on top of our piers, precast piers, and the guy on the forklift delivering more floor and wall panels to the site. Next slide. So this is the core that we set up, and again, this is prototype 0. We built this. This is the first one we did on our own lot that we still own today. So we use a zip wall system here. But like in all the slides you saw before, it is a wall panelized section. So with a temporary roof. Next slide, please. So really hard to read this one. Sorry about that. But just to kind of talk about the workflow of the process. So obviously after disaster, with this model, you have some offsite construction taking place, and that would be in terms of putting together all of these panelized systems. And then obviously the on-site construction would be, after a fire or a flood or a hurricane, there's obviously debris on families' lots that need to be addressed. So the on-site, on-site component is cleaning up these neighborhoods, creating spaces where we can drop, this temporary to perm model. And then obviously there's kind of the outreach and eligibility piece of this program, right? So our outreach workers, we gave them the title as navigators, right? So navigators would lead families through the entire process, becoming eligible, working with designers, knowing what their home was going to look like, and having them be involved in the addition and build on process. Next. So what you can see in green is the core. And now we are in the addition phase of it, contributing to, the permanent home that we, want to build. Next slide, please. And here is the home complete. On the right, what's in green, that was the core that you saw on the previous slide. So the porch that was on the core, that became a bedroom. The living room and kitchen became another bedroom. That wet wall stayed the same, and because the core had the full size bathroom, that's stayed the same. And then the original bedroom that was in the core. The addition, the left side of the home that you can see was a brand new big beautiful porch, a new living and dining room, and a full-size kitchen with a back porch. Sorry, I don't have a photo of that. With a back porch that has kind of a closet for washer and dryer room. Next slide, please. So just a diagram of the program again. So we were the developer on the project. BC Workshop were the designers and planners. Loop and Arise, our local organizers, where our navigators, our outreach arm, and Texas Housers and A&M were our policy research and advocates on this. Next slide, please. So here's just us kind of going through the planning phases of how this program should work, and the things that we needed to address. Obviously, reconstruction programs and affordable housing after disaster is very cumbersome task to take on. And so there was many sessions of us just kind of walking through different scenarios of how best to run this program. Next slide, please. We had an open house when we built the core. This is a local state senator, Lucio, that we were able to tour around and have him visit the site. He was a big champion for this model. Next slide, please. Here is a community meeting being held by Lupe. it was very important to engage in the communities that we serve so that they could have a seat at the table when we discuss what a housing project that would affect their lives, be a part of. So it's really important to get community feedback on the way we were designing the program and how a home should look like, and the process that they may one day go through, or a family member or a friend. Next slide, please. So another difficult slide to read. But basically, this just talks about some of the deliverables for the program. So obviously, we wanted to, rethink construction a bit, and we did that through the penalized system that we created, making sure that the outreach and the design component of the program, made some sense, and we put some thought behind it. And then obviously partnering with local groups makes a whole lot of sense, and making sure that we're bringing local other important organizations to the table to help us plan some of this. And then obviously, the pre-disaster planning is, we built some houses and that's great, but the pre-disaster planning and all of the work that went into that is I think where the real kind of magic lies within this program. Next slide, please. So this Rapido, it is not a response to disaster housing. If your community was hit by a flood or a hurricane or fire or tornado, you are too late to use Rapido. Right? This is a pre-recovery model. If you need to plan for these disasters, the planning needs to happen now and not wait for a disaster to hit. So part of that is, why we had community meetings to talk about a pre-design process, right? Obviously, if you're working in your communities, you know what your landscapes look like, the vulnerable areas, the people that are going to suffer the most when a disaster hits. So why not engage those families now, right? And ask, hey, if we had to rebuild your house, what would it look like? Next slide, please. Excuse me. Now we talk about pre-procurement. You have local suppliers that you're working with now, local builders and other trades. Why not engage them today to let them know that in the event of a disaster, we want to use you, right? We want to use the materials that you provide. We want to use your labor and the resources that you have. Next slide, please. And preparedness and training. It makes a lot of sense to use, maybe there's a local church group in your community that has, a great relationship with families. It would make sense to use them as an outreach arm, right? Why, reinvent the wheel here after disaster and, bring an outside outreach company or marketing company to help figure out a housing process when locally there are people that you can use to help navigate these families through a reconstruction program after a disaster. Next slide, please. So another one to read, but just reemphasizing the importance of sticking to your communities, working in your communities, and making sure that you're able to bring back people to the neighborhoods that they're from, that they've lived in for many years, that they've chose, to live in, even though they might have issues with drainage, or they're close to the coast, and when a hurricane comes, they're going to be a vulnerable home that needs, that's going to need some attention. But bringing in the communities, working with the families, making sure they have a choice and a say and a seat at the table, and local, working with the local trades and building suppliers, just so full circle here on strengthening communities, right? Because the people, the builders, the families, they work somewhere, right? And keeping families in their neighborhoods is the most important thing we can do here, right? The last thing we want to do is displace families, have communities, be lost because of the natural disasters, that they have to deal with that are, no fault of their own. Next slide, please. So here are a few shots of some of the houses that we built. and providing choice, has been just a big component in the everyday work that we do, whether it's the house they want, it's the loan product they want, it's any type of services that we provide. We do a lot of credit counseling and working with families to that, but the more choice that we can provide to our families is what we try to focus on. Next slide, please. And this was us giving former Secretary Castro a tour of some of the projects that we're working on, and this kind of rapido design and form of a response to reconstruction after a natural disaster. And something that we did this many years ago. Obviously, hurricanes come and go, tornadoes come and go, floods happen. But we've realized that we are dealing with a disaster, now and every day, and that's within the populations we serve. Substandard housing, not enough, rentals out there for people. And so what, this Rapido kind of morphed into a response to dealing with, the standards of living that our families are dealing with now. So Rapido's kind of morphed into a new program we call Mi Casita. Same concept, except we've moved on from a wall panelized system to a full build out of a 12 by 24 module home, regular stick built construction that gets built in a factory and shipped to site. And the unique thing about Mi Casita is that that now there's a loan component, and the loan component can grow with the home. So let's say you just get the core now. A few years later, you can add on a bedroom or a bathroom, expand your home, and that loan will grow with the home. And that's about it for now. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Leo. That was really terrific. And I really love the recovery. And you may stress several times that you can't start when and after the disaster happens. And the pictures and the charts, you really did some great work that can be adapted in other settings. So again, let's have, thank you. Can I have the next slide, the summary slide? I don't know where Adriana is. So I want to conclude again, thank our panelists for providing some really good case examples and really understanding the importance and how this work really integrates into your core mission and work. The CCRH Rural Disaster Guide and recommendations will be really helpful, even though, and we wrote it not just California, we're focused on California, but some of the recommendations are broader. I'd also like to stress the importance of advocacy and resources to this effort as it grows over time with the disasters. I mentioned earlier the CDBG disaster recovery funds are really important, and the National Income Housing Coalition is helping champion permanent funding of that as part of the CDBG appropriation process. So really critical, because time matters, and it's hard to bridge finance, a lot of money when you have to be involved in a lot of substantial housing rebuilding. Plug into national networks, I think, like the coalition. NCRC's work is what we're trying to do is have disaster work seen as a core element of CRA, meaning the CRA tests, the various lending, investment, service tests, really important. The work that enterprise community partners and others have done around design and replication. And actually, they've actually funded, I'm not going to say CDCB, to expand that concept, the Rapido concept through La Casita. So again, many others. And again, I guess my sort of final thought before we get into the question and answers is don't wait for it to happen. Be ahead of the curve, or using in one of my favorite analogies, you may end up knee deep with alligators or trying to outdistance a fire, and fires are fast. So again, plan, think, engage, and participate with others. So again, thank you for having the opportunity to workshop. Again, thank our panelists for their presentations, and we'll go to questions and answers right now. I guess we're live. We again want to thank Leo and Veronica for the really terrific presentations, and also mention that we're going to put in the chat the link for the CCRH World Disaster Guidebook and AB 880, which is the bridge financing legislation in California that will really help get money quicker to housing recovery. So I'm looking to see if I don't see the comments. I see that we're live. We also want to draw from you, from our attendees, your thoughts, your experience. Some of you have had a lot of experience here. Share what you're learning. Share some of your challenges and comments, and then we can feed off on that. So actually, what I'm going to start while we're waiting for comments is have Leo talk a little bit more about Mi Casita and sort of how you're rolling it out in other communities around the country.
Sure. And first, I think there's a few questions from Mr. Ware that I think I can answer first. So
Great.
He asked how much these houses were going for. The Rapido houses, those were CDBG DR funds. So those, fortunately were free to the family. But those ranged in a variety of prices depending on the number of bedrooms. But a rough out finished core at the time where a family could live in cost us right under $40,000. And then obviously demos vary, right, depending on how big and how much debris needs to be removed from a lot. Those always vary. Obviously now with prices, and I'm not too sure, Mrs. Ware, where you're from, but right now in South Texas, lumber, and I know it's kind of nationwide with certain products, but lumber's outrageous right now. So suppliers are only holding prices for me for about 2 weeks right now, and that's we do over 100 houses a year, and another 50 to 100 rental units a year, and so we're a big producer, and I can only have prices being held for 2 weeks at a time. So obviously that's tough for everyone to navigate. Another question here is financing available? Yes and no. So like Bob said, I'll talk a little bit more about Mi Casita. So like I said, it is an evolution of the Rapido program. Right now we're in our R&D stage of Mi Casita. So we are building prototypes in a factory yard and completing them out as best we can and deploying them out to site. And yes, there is financing available. And like I did say during the presentation, that the families can build what they can afford today. And down the road, if they need to add some bedrooms or a bathroom or, some office space, because they're working from home now and, aren't renting office space out in the community, we can, add that too. And the loan product actually will grow with them, right? So as you add on to the house, we would refinance the loan and, they have their new payment. Mi Casita is on the verge of being created to be franchised. So we have a few partners that we're working with in Mississippi and in Colorado and Arkansas and Tennessee, where we're starting to have conversations about the adaptation of the program. So, building, one way in South Texas is probably done a different way in, another part of the country. And so right now we're just trying to figure out the best way to kind of franchise the program. And that involves a few things. It's a design component. It's the loan component. It's all of the kind of design work that goes into creating a program like this. I think there's a question for Veronica. No.
Yeah, from Renee about CCRH's work and CCRH does work in native rural communities. You want to respond to that? Veronica may add a little bit to it.
By all means. So yes, CCRH works closely with Native communities across California. And in fact, one of the other case studies in the guidebook focuses in on Northern Circle and kind of some of their COVID response work in particular. And what's interesting, I think, about the case study there, and I'll let Bob elaborate since it was his interview, but it's a lot more focused on relationship building, and there's a lot more flexibility available in some cases. So Native communities are often historically and currently super under-resourced, right? But what was great with the Northern Circle tribes is that they were able to quickly respond to COVID, saw that their residents were going to be unable to pay rents, and were able to implement a rent forgiveness program, kind of a rent pause, within weeks. While I think statewide, we were still thinking about like, oh, how could we find the funding? Maybe this is the right move, maybe it's not. They were able to be much more responsive to their community's needs, and because they were willing to put their residents first and say, we can figure out how to make this happen on the back end later. What we need to do is keep people housed. And Bob, if there's anything you want to add, feel free.
Which is also where Paradise is. And in Humboldt County, there were several fires in 2018 and 2019, and several of the tribes had houses burned down. So Northern Circles has been working on the renovation, accessing financing, because these are very isolated. And so they've really developed capacity to raise dollars and to respond quickly to the outcomes and impact of the fires. And so there's again, a capacity that they're building, and hopefully don't have to use this year. But as I said, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, the northern part of the state's been on fire. And so it's really critical, and it's hard to catch up with it, but they've actually started responding a couple of years ago with financing, trying to also keep members in their community. That's one of the issues we talked about, is that when rural communities or houses are lost, there's a lot of geography, and they may not be able to move to their neighbor or their relative in the next city. They have to go further. So trying to keep them as close as possible to where they live for a lot of reasons. Other questions or comments? And again, please also share your experience that you've had around disaster planning and response. And again, encourage you to look at the guidebook as we posted, as Veronica's posted. Yeah, please don't share it more broadly, because we're actually finalizing it, and we'll have the next couple weeks, we'll have the final version out, and then we'll share it with NCRC and with all the members. And again, it's California focused, but the lessons are much broader, and the resource section too can be really helpful, and the case examples. And they engage a lot of interesting partners. That's one of the things in doing the interviews, when I got interviews at 6 sites, is that to an organization, they said what COVID and what response to fires has led to new partnerships. And we mentioned Red Cross and United Way, which are fairly traditional, but we didn't talk about Pepsi-Cola. We didn't talk about a river conservatory. There's some really interesting and eclectic partnerships, and rural affordable housing developers and CDCs are really steeped in the culture of partnerships. Because when you're doing housing, you have multiple partners and funders. So it's part of your DNA. So you have a natural role to play. I also see, is construction built for any climate? Lena, why don't you take a shot at that in terms of South Texas, and then we can talk a little bit about California.
Sure. So our program, it's obviously down here, we know what it takes to build houses in our environment. Part of the reasons of partnering with people, out of state and across the country, is to adapt the program to meet, the building standards of your own community, right? So if you're in the Midwest and, the cold is a problem, your home needs more insulation, then obviously we would, adapt the construction to meet your specific standards of the communities you serve. And there's another question here about the factory and if we own it through a partnership. The factory here that we were working in, we own it. We're lucky enough to have, quite a bit of land at our disposal that we own. So, we just took some acreage that we had available and put our factory on it.
It's nice to have, yeah. But there's a lot of, ways to acquire land or lease land to do developments like that. Veronica, do you want to talk about the climate unit buildings in California, and I can add to that? The question about climate and how you build housing.
Sure. I mean, California has historically been home to earthquakes, so Californians are used to designing their housing around that kind of natural disaster. We're seeing emerging practices around integrating wildlife-urban interface codes into building codes, thinking about property management from a disaster mitigation perspective. So that looks like clearing your defensible space, maintaining your gutters, working with residents to do emergency planning. So making sure you have a plan for the building if in the case of evacuation. And that's particularly crucial as we move in California also towards more dense housing. So there's a little bit of a tension around creating denser and denser housing, because that can become more difficult to evacuate as you put more people trying to get through the same number of exits, right? So trying to balance those priorities of denser housing and housing you can get out of in a timely fashion in an emergency. Similarly, with transit-oriented development, you may be building, assuming that your residents don't have cars, which is great. Love having active transportation-friendly communities. But again, if you're looking to outrun a fire, and you have a set of residents who are less likely to own cars, that requires more of those creative partnerships Bob was talking about. So is that working with your transit agency? Is that working with other emergency services providers to make sure that when a disaster hits, how your residents are going to be able to evacuate?
Yeah, and what I would add on climate is that California is a big state, but I would say the vast majority of low-income rental housing, rural housing, rental and home ownership and self-help are in warm climates. In the Central Valley, which gets very hot, they're probably in the heat season right now, where they'll have 3 to 4 months of over 100 degrees. And Southern California, especially in the desert, there's a very successful affordable housing developer that's probably in the hottest, one of the hottest spots in the United States, the Coachella Valley. So in terms of the design, it's really critical in terms of making walls thick, using really core principles to try to keep the heat outside in the summer, and then keep it as cool as possible, and then ventilate it and open up at night when it cools down about 30 degrees. So yeah, climate and location, siting, green materials, durable, really important in terms of climate, thinking through the climate implications and the fact that it's getting warmer when you're building affordable housing or replacing affordable housing as a result of a natural disaster.
And yeah, Renee, I love your comment about the overlap with the work that public health departments are doing around disaster preparedness. We work pretty closely with a coalition of public health officials and advocates around housing preservation and how some housing retrofits can make the housing more healthy, but also preserve it as affordable housing. And our focus has been mostly around air quality in that arena, but it's completely true with disaster planning as well. And to that point about hotter and hotter climates, looking at green energy solutions, right? And how do we keep residents' utility bills low, even as they might be cranking their AC to offset these hotter and hotter days?
Yeah, no, it's a really good comment. I would just add that disaster mitigation planning and preparedness is just really another competency or skill set for addressing social determinants of health. And sadly, and again, we talked about heat, and actually I should put a plug in for Bruce Mitchell, who's the research team at NCRC. He's wonderful. He actually did his dissertation on hotspots. So he helped give Veronica and myself some really good resources. So in addition to knowing CRA and food deserts and other things, he's a really good resource around this whole connectivity. And then we have a question from Keith, which I'm going to ask Leo to answer, since he's our really only direct practitioner amongst the three of us, is the one about certified contingency planners, such helping laypersons in the community. And I think it's you're doing a lot of that, working with your residents, getting them aware, your pre-recovery. That's really sort of at the core of pre-recovery. You want to add a little bit?
Sure. I'm not sure I understand the full length of the question, but I would seek out the nonprofits in your community that are working with the vulnerable populations now. I'm not 100% sure what a certified contingency planner does. So, but I assure you, any nonprofit in your community is always looking for some type of help. And so, it's seeing what, their mission is, seeing if it aligns with something you are comfortable working on, and, helping them connect to other resources the best way you could. And hope that somewhat answers your question, Keith. I see there's
Yeah.
another question here about Rapido and how quickly the base home can be placed on a site. That varies a bit. It just depends how much demo needs to be done on the lot. But when a lot was fully cleared and we placed a core on an empty lot, it only took us 4 days to put up the home. And remember, this is only 400 square feet, so it's not a lot of space, especially when you're building the panelized wall systems, and somewhere else and waiting to be deployed. So 4 days.
Thank you. We also have a couple questions from Ella about, are you using solar and wind power to help residents save energy? Want to take a shot at that, Lynn, and then I'll add to it?
Sure. Unfortunately, we aren't. Not really. It's available in our communities, but it's still very pricey. And so, we're still a nonprofit developer. So, these added kind of increases to the construction budget are pretty difficult for us right now. But I'm really excited for that first time. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, California, we're seeing a little bit of it, because there's a real need to move it to multifamily, to have rooftop solar go to multifamily, but the financing is tricky. And so we do have the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, which is one of the programs that came out of the cap and trade resources that we have. And so there are nonprofits, affordable housing developers that are using it. It's not common yet, but we're starting to look at some innovative financing tools with some of the solar companies and the tax credits. But what people really need is almost like a refundable credit. It's almost like, think of it as an earned income tax credit where you get money. You don't wait to the back end, but you need the money early. And so if you can make it refundable, then you can then have some capital to then finance the solar panels, the rooftop solar panels. But it's pretty complicated. Do you want to add anything to that, Veronica?
I do, yeah. A lot of our developers work with solar particularly. I've seen a little bit less wind, but I wanted to shout out Mutual Housing in Woodland, California, created a farm worker affordable housing community that is entirely net zero and has actually been touted as a global model. And generally speaking, we see our developers using a lot of renewable energy and doing a lot of work around energy efficiency and LEED certification. Part of that's because affordable housing developers are mandated to exceed Title 24 standards in California, especially if they want to be competitive in these funding programs. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, and I don't see much on wind power. I mean, there is wind power in California, but I don't think it's been really connected to affordable housing or housing construction in general. Now there's talking about offshore wind. So it's a little bit behind, but solar, yeah, because you probably may be aware that all new construction for solar buildings after 2020 must use solar. It's 100%. So that's obviously provided an incentive base to do it. And then of course the challenge then is to do it with affordable housing multifamily units, and try to get the solar panels into those units to cut costs for the developer and then save the residents some money. Any other questions? Or I think we're right at 5 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock in Texas, and 2 p.m. in California. So again, thank you for the questions, and again, thank NCRC for having us talk about just recovery, and a special thanks to Katie Roundtree, the conference planner, for supporting this workshop. And please, check the publications, and look forward to staying in touch with you and being a resource. Have a good weekend and happy Friday. And thanks, Veronica and Leah.